Welcome to this new episode of Organizing at the Edge. Today I'm really pleased to have a longtime friend, a person I really learned a lot about, Ted Rowe. Ted, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
The pleasure is all mine. I suspect many people in this space already know you, but let me give you the chance to introduce yourself and to talk a bit sociocracy, a topic I suspect we'll cover in this conversation.
Yeah, about me, born and raised in Germany. My first love, as somebody once said, was linguistics. I studied linguistics, did my PhD, then my postdoc work around syntax and how we hold facts in language. Brought me to the US, and then I stayed there for more than 15 years. And that's also what then, after dropping out of academia, which is its own story, um, that brought me in contact with Sociocracy because I just happened to stumble into this community that was running sociocratically. Well, I had just adopted Sociocracy when I arrived there, and I knew nothing. But then I noticed that this is actually quite cool. And then I got completely sucked into the world of sociocracy for quite a while. And that's where I still spend a lot of my time. I think of myself as having kind of three different places where I am right now. One is I'm still part of Sociocracy for All, the organization that I founded that is turning 10 years old this year. And so I do a lot of training of trainers and client work and all of that. And then the other one is I just started a job as interim executive director of the Center for Nonviolent Communication, which is also something I care about a lot, as kind of something that works really well together, kind of on the same mission on as all the rest. And the other piece is I've been doing a fair bit of digging under a working title that I call Wiser Organizations, or organizations that make sense, around just trying to dig a little deeper of what is under the different, like what's the deeper code of where we are and how we think about governance in general. I'm sure all of these things will come up. That's why I mentioned them.
I have the same feeling. Can you tell us a bit more about sociocracy? If you had to summarize it, summarize what sociocracy brings to organizations, maybe to society. What is the value in it? What are the pillars?
Yeah. So first, what are the pillars? I would think of it as three different parts. The first part is decentralized decision making, which means it is basically a code of how to decide who decides what. It gives us clarity on how we decide, who decides what, because that's where we can get lost. And that way we have distributed decision making and the ideal of an organization where a lot of decisions are made in many different places. The other one is kind of the counter move, which is alignment. How do you get alignment? Well, alignment you get through consent. So that's how we make decisions for policy decisions, like pattern setting decisions, which are made in a way so everybody who has some insight in that area will be asked for their consent so that we can run every decision that we make through that alignment filter and see does it match with what we're trying to do. And then the third one I think of as the pillar of feedback and just incremental improvement, so that even the system itself is something that we can improve incrementally to an extent. I mean, one could, in theory, by consent, decide to get rid of consent, but that's where I would draw the line. I don't think that's the best idea unless it has some good guidelines around it. And then what it brings, it depends on where people are coming from. Um, I I that's a little bit of an oversimplification, I think, but one can think of it as two directions, right? There are the organizations that I have a lot of experience with that come from lack of clarity, and then what it brings is clarity. Finally, we know who decides what, and we don't have to go around and try to get everybody together and somehow figure out who's going to decide on this thing. And then at the other end is where there's a lot of clarity, like the clarity is your boss decides. And then it brings more participation and a little bit of a broader and wider view of perspectives that go into decision making. So depending on where we are, that's what it brings.
Thank you so much. Why deciding how to decide is so important in general, and maybe right now, this specific time of history?
That's a big question. Well, I mean, let's look at it in a on a smaller scale first. I remember it was a formative moment for me where somebody talked to me and said, "Well, we're basically using Sociocracy already." And I said, "Well, that's great. Tell me about it." And she said, "Well, we have different teams that do different things." And like, okay, you know. And then I asked, "So if you had to ever change which team does what, how would you do it?" And she looked at me with big eyes, had no response whatsoever, and I think she noticed in that moment of, oh wow, how would we do that? And then I asked her, like, where does the current team structure even come from? And she said, well, that was set up at the beginning. The founder set that up. And he asked, where's the founder now? And she said, oh, he's long dead. It's like, okay. And the problem with that, of course, is, that's all fine for a while, but eventually all this stuff needs to breathe and change because what do you do if something isn't clear? You can never predict everything. It comes kind of from this idea that it's like a machine, right? You set it up in the beginning and then everything just runs. But done. But of course, that's not an option because everything will change, will not get it right. Just a million different ways in which we need to change things. And that's where people then run into issues if they don't even know how to decide who decides, then they're just forever in that loop of not really knowing. And then what happens sadly, and that's what I watch quite a bit, is then we're in this phase where there's no agency because nobody can resolve it. No one person can resolve it. And then either we just spin our wheels for years, and I've seen that plenty, or we have somebody who just makes an executive decision for the sake of agency, which I understand. But then, of course, that just increases the turmoil and the pushback. And then we add a whole emotional layer to everything, and it doesn't get better from that.
So it is about clarity. It is about people feeling
Evolution.
engaged into yeah, clearer boundaries and rules. But is there any worldview behind it? Is there any idea of what a fair society should be, what a fair company should be, what a welcoming environment for human beings should look like?
Oh, I find that such a difficult question because I think I go back and forth so much on that because I hold almost like I mean, that is part of the chaotic piece, right? Holding the both and because both of them have their place. And most people come from this way or that way. And I find that antagony gets played out so much of like, oh, we don't want structure because that will suffocate creativity. And like, well, we like it's just they are played against each other. And then so there's this worldview of everything should be a free for all and everybody should be included in everything. And then there's the people who insist on clarity and order, and they don't seem to get to this place of how about both and depending on what works best right now. And then we need that meta question that I would like to have more conversations about on how do we know whether this moment calls for more openness or whether this moment calls for more clarity and order or whatever words we put on them. Like that's the skill we need to have. It's a meta skill, and so many people and organizations are not able to even be at that point. So I think the worldviews behind it, some of them are like inclusion over everything, participation, like the more the merrier, sometimes how I describe it. The more the merrier, the more participation, the better. With no sense of human capacity having limitations. Like that to me is just like this, like an over glorification of an abundance mindset of we can all just, we can have it all if we just whatever participate out of it. And then the other ones, it's like everything that is not neat and clear is kind of the enemy impersonated, and there's not a great meta discernment about it.
So, what I'm hearing is that you can have the best of both worlds, and especially you can take as an organization responsibility for your own unique mix at a specific point in time of how much order and clarity and structure you want, or how much chaos, if you like that way, you want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I want to bring sociocracy in here because I find that people often misunderstand that in that sociocracy says, for example, everything needs to be neatly packaged into whatever. And to me, it's just a tool that lets you then tailor it to the extent that you want it. Like, for example, one could push the dial to an extreme hierarchical view, right? I know you know that just for being, one could say, like, for example, I've been around when we made a decision that like we were running out of time on a big thing. And then basically the proposal was Ted decides. Everybody consented, and all of a sudden I found myself with this humongous bit of power, and just having to decide all by myself, which is fine. But I guess I'm telling that story because we could define a role that basically clusters a lot of power into one role, and then we almost have like a consented to a hierarchy, and that's great. And we can also dial it the other way and refuse to distribute most of the domains and just live out, blissful, like blissed out chaos. And we can even do it in different pockets of the organization differently. If we have an area where we want to run it more loosely, do it. If we have an area that is like, for example, if we want to do budget and strategy, heavily kind of relying on an individual, do it. But exactly what you say, the responsibility is in the people who then tailor and customize the system using the tools to the situation that they're in. But that requires not blaming a system, but just using the system in service of what you're trying to do. But that's on people to do.
Yeah, what I find really interesting in sociocracy and powerful is this increased awareness that is required to people to understand the importance of deciding together, because that's power. And we tend to be quite passive, especially people in organizations, in hierarchical organizations, to be a bit, used to accept that power over you instead of being an active or proactive player into that game. And I think this is both about speed, it is both about quality. There are many implications, and it's totally fluid. It's up to you. My next question is, what is it into all of this that resonates with Ted? Who Ted is, basically your inner beliefs, your story as a human being, not just as a professional or as a teacher, as a pioneer in sociocracy.
I think what these last 10 years have allowed me to do is to, in a way, come to terms with my own relationship to power. And that means my own power, and that's a deeply personal thing, right? And I remember, for example, there were a few moments that I go back to on this, which is realizing that I had always held this idea that, like, so typically just kind of instruction manual for TED is I want things to kind of move along. And I have a lot of capacity and agency to move things along. And what has happened with that in the past is that I sometimes was kind of like outside of, yeah, like prior to finding sociocracy, is that I found that either I got blamed for being the person who pushes, or blamed for holding power, or I held back and then kind of compromising on my own sense of integrity, which doesn't seem to serve. If I can do things, want to do things, but I don't, that doesn't seem to be the point of doing something together. And I remember still the moment where it clicked for me, where I was like, oh, sociocracy allows me to move things forward, but gives me the tools on how to do it so that it's not becoming a power over or a power under thing. I'm not withdrawing my own agency, and I'm not exerting it over others if I know how to work within a system. So to me, it provides almost like guardrails, so that I can play. And that's just so liberating to me. So in a way, it really healed my own relationship to power, which tended to be that I felt like I had too much of it. Or like I don't even use the word power for myself so much anymore. I think of agency really much more than power, because power gets so complicated with everything else. But I have a high level of agency. Like I'm able to wield the world around me quite well to do what I want to do. That's probably my biggest privilege that somehow, I mean, yeah, there's one could talk a lot about why that might be so. But that's maybe not the point of this here. Anyway, so that's what I learned to do better. And I'm incredibly happy for that because I don't need to choose anymore between what I want and what the group wants. I can find how to integrate the two to something better.
Yeah, beautiful, very profound. Um, let's go to the next step. So we talked a little bit about sociocracy overall, about yourself and your relationship with sociocracy, but let's think uh, about some organizations that are adopting sociocratic principles and practices, and explore how that looks like. So the first question I have is what is the amount of freedom that a circle is the basic, let's say, the atom, the basic structure in a sociocratic organization. What's the amount of freedom that a circle can have? Is it like an isolated part of the organization? Is it connected to the organization? What can it decide about everything or something else?
I'm taking a deep breath because this is both what I'm very interested in, and I think it's an abstract and like a conversation that many people don't have that I think we should have. So, but it's a little bit of I think it's a little there's a fair bit of abstraction to it. So, let's just take sociocracy first, the rule set, so that we have that clear. The rule set is, again, I know you know that, but we imagine that everything, like the domain of deciding anything, is like one big pizza. And then what sociocracy does, it basically says this third, like this slide of everything, this piece of the domain, let's say everything that has to do with, I don't know, a website, now gets transferred into a circle, and that becomes an agreement between the circle, in this case, a general circle that gives out the domain, and the receiving circle. They basically have that direct agreement, which is what a domain is. That's an agreement of we're giving this to you. You are now authorized to make decisions there. And then website circle in this example, it could take that and hold on to some of it, but could also kind of send it downward, so to speak, into a subcircle. Same thing happens again. So it's like the fractal rule set of how to distribute domains. Now, that I think is great. It provides a lot of clarity, and it also provides one gap that happens quite a bit, and that if in your original setup you forgot something or something new comes up, like, I don't know, AI, oh, we never made a decision on who makes decisions about whether we use AI because it didn't exist when we made this agreement. Then you have a landing place like a distribution center with a general circle, so you know who decides if that's unclear. So now you have a system that is self-repairing and can do that. And I hope this is the place for it. And I think there is something fundamental that one has to ask about here, which is, do we want to be in a system where we want to have a positive list of all the domain pieces? And what do we do with the things that are undefined? Do we say everything needs to be defined, like everything in an exhaustive way needs to be placed in a domain? Or do we say, no, everything that we make a statement about will be placed, but it's also fine if some things just kind of float? And those to me are two completely different worldviews. One assumes that we can even make an exhaustive agreement, and I don't believe we can, honestly. But some people act as if that is so. And then there's the other side where I keep insisting that one has to, for sanity and for so many different reasons, also agency, one has to hold sociocracy as a system as everything is allowed until it's not. Which means that if something is not placed as a domain, it's a free-for-all. If something is not regulated in a role or in a policy, that means you can, like, if it's not forbidden, you can do it. If it's not placed somewhere, you can do it. If we don't do that, it would be insanity because we would have to constantly spend a lot of our time in defining roles, placing this there and there. And it becomes insane. I don't want to be in that kind of organization because it would be super bureaucratic. Sometimes we have to be able to wing something without defining it first. And sociocracy allows that, but it depends on the mental model that people hold when they use it. And I find that that is a conversation that is not being had enough.
I think you're raising a key point and something I have personal experience of. Basically, what you are saying is that the design, or better, the evolution of security organizations is inherently incremental. There is no point in imagining a starting point in time in which you have to define everything or to be exhaustive, and even more fundamentally, to be able to describe the world, even only the part of the world of the organization is interested into, completely. In
Mhm.
my experience, this is very difficult to accept to some
Yes.
people, and the
Yeah.
organization is stuck at the beginning, just designing for things that may happen or may never happen. Right here, the mindset is the opposite. When a problem will rise a few times, not once, maybe, it becomes so important that we have to define the rules for addressing it. Right?
Yep.
Okay.
And then, ironically, that means on this very deep level, I don't mean in the day to day, and I don't mean in kind of on circle level, so to speak, but as a fundamental code underneath, there is still, even in many self-organized organizations, the mindset of control of the world is in principle controllable. And I don't believe that. So, and that's super scary because it means I don't actually have full control over the outcomes. That means, but yeah, that acceptance of, oh, ultimately what we're doing is we're continuously fumbling. There is no pure state of having everything under control. We will never reach it. We've never reached it. I think that's something one has to accept. And that's actually interestingly, and that's kind of my wise organizations work around that, because I first thought, when originally kind of when I departed on my detour, there was some strain in me of thinking maybe I'm actually leaving sociocracy behind. Maybe I just don't believe in the basic premise, you know? So I kind of took this detour and did both things in parallel, feeling a little awkward about it. But I basically came back going like, oh no, it's just a tool set. If you accept that basic premise, you can use it as a tool set. None that it's exactly the same thing. You're doing the same thing, but you're doing it knowing that you can never fully succeed and control everything. And then you just do it anyway.
Let me connect this to some additional angles. One angle is why is this level of autonomy, the domain, and let's say the spaces that circle has so important for human beings, for people, members in a circle, for teams? Why as human beings we need that? What does it happen if you don't have that? And connecting to it on the other side is, but if every circle can decide autonomously, is there a common direction for the entire organization? Or are we just becoming a sort of Frankenstein with different pieces going everywhere, a sort of anarchy?
Yeah. Well, I'm curious what you say about that. I mean, my first guess on why is it so hard for people just psychologically is, I mean, people are not so great at uncertainty. So just the fact that there's uncertainty burns some fuses somehow. Before I go to the other topic, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that this is a muscle we unfortunately are not trained to use. And with that, I mean 100 years, not 5 years. So we want that, but we are not used to that. And we are not, on average, as human beings in organizations, ready to do it. So it creates discomfort.
And of course, there's a lot said around that, right? I mean, if we go to that time scale, there's this whole modernity idea, right? The modernity comes with the assumptions of controllability and all of that. It also comes with the mindset of failure is bad, for example, and that means you somehow screwed up. And to me, I think I feel so much for people who were raised and educated and made early life choices, for example, around education, investing like in university education, for example, as one of the examples. We were basically raised into a system where the modernity mindset applies. And we, like you and my generation, we were raised on that of if you do all those things, you will be fine. But now that's not, it doesn't carry over anymore. And basically, like several generations of people have kind of sent into this abyss of you were raised on certainty. Ah, sorry, it wasn't true, you know? And I guess what I'm saying is to me, it's more than a mindset thing. That too, that's big. And it is also, we've built our lives around this. You can't just tell somebody, oh yeah, sorry, you invested 20 years of, working every weekend and every night on your career, but careers are not really a thing anymore. It's like you can't do that. Um, so to me, I'm just so aware of how the interlocking systems of everything have been aligned with that idea of modernity that now we see, ooh, oops.
Is this cultural? Probably you lived in different places, different cultures, but you interacted with different organizations from different countries. Is this changing in the Nordics and the United States, in Germany, in other parts of Europe or Asia?
I mean, I see that, for example, Central Europe or Northern Europe has a little bit more capacity for it. One thing that comes up for me, super unpopular opinion, I'm going to say it anyway, super unpopular. But I find that, for example, in progressive places, sometimes spaces, there's sometimes this, it's still a desire to control. Like, for example, if you want to control the outcome that you will feel safe. Like even psychological safety, although of course it's super important and like I'm not proposing like psychological safety. And if you want to control the outcome that it will be psychologically safe, you will basically be in a control paradigm. You will, so it's run so deep somehow. There's like several layers of all of it. And like, yeah, so I see definitely cultural, but I guess, and ironically, I mean, maybe this wasn't the best example, though I think it's a striking one. But I think one needs a lot of that comfort and psychological safety to hold that level of uncertainty. So that's where it all kind of gets mixed together. So I think there are some different places where it's like where that is different. And overall, I think there's a humongous, humongous need for that honesty around that. Of how do we adjust to a world where those safety things are not a guarantee
So
anymore.
what we are saying is that sociocracy helps organizations to be more in flux, more adaptive to the big uncertainty that we are unfortunately all living into. But what is it happening at the individual level? What is it asked to the member, to this individual being into an organization? So, how does sociocracy help human beings to, yeah, unleash themselves to express their full potential on one side? But what is also asked to them? Are we expecting everybody to act as an adult, to act as an entrepreneur, for example, in a more business sense? What is the expectation on the individual within a circle, within more circles, within an organization that maybe wasn't there in the past?
Mhm. I think it's a radical self-responsibility that we're asking more than anything else. Being able to think for the whole while also tracking yourself. Like, for example, let's look at consent, just to make it very specific. In consent, we're asking people to, sure, raise their opinion and whatever comes up for them personally, and then basically say, okay, that just happened, and now I'm asking for consent. That's why I'm not asking for what you think. I'm asking you to think for the organization of, is there mismatch with the aim? So that's a huge ask for some people of holding their own and like taking care of their own feelings and needs while then being able to step in but they're also not disconnected, right? Because it might be that whatever, let's say something upsets you, there might be information in that anger that actually is information that is relevant for the organization. So I don't want to make it like an artificial split of like there's you and there's the organization. I think one can totally overdo that. So basically we're asking almost like three things, hold yourself, hold the organization, and pay attention to that to the interaction between the two of them, because that's also where useful information could be. That's a lot of things that we're asking. Like that requires a lot from people. I also want to say though that I think what I like about sociocracy, just as a flavor of a method or sets of methods, is that it gives people some it gives them like a practice ground. It doesn't rely on it always coming out perfectly. There is kind of stuff that go like there's an image that I really love that somebody brought up who started the children's parliaments in neighborhood parliaments in India, Edwin John. This is an image from him. He said like in a group we're like pebbles in a river, and we smoothen each other out. And I remember hearing that, and all in me wanted to just be a pebble. It's like, let me be a pebble. That sounds like a gorgeous, gorgeous thing to do. So that smoothing each other out, you don't have to come in and already be perfect at it. There will be some messiness, but ultimately, for example, through rounds, you kind of work it out and you can, so it's both a requirement and also something that you learn over time more and more.
So we covered a bit the, let's say, psychological aspect of for individuals, but more technically, when we talk about consent, we talked about the roles in a circle. How different is it for members to be in a self-managed thing, in a self-managed circle, to coordinate work without a boss? And how different is it for former bosses to be into this space in which, yeah, they cannot no longer boss people around? So what is left for them to do in a self-managed circle?
So individuals need to learn to basically see what works needs doing. For example, if something isn't being done, they can't just complain that nobody does it or wait for the boss to pick it up. They need to go, hey, I noticed a gap. Can we talk about it? Can we fill it? So everybody basically is on that cleanup and maintenance work around how we set things up. That takes a while for people to land there, and I noticed that it's just very easy to lean back and go like, I guess the system sucks because we don't have anybody who does this and that. Like, no, you are actually one of the people that can clean it up. Um, and then on the flip side, for bosses, I think it depends, I think, a lot on the individual mindset of why like how they saw and conceptualized their own role as bosses. Do they think they know better? Then they need to learn to listen. Do they think everything is easier if somebody just decides? Then they need to learn that balance between that is sometimes true and sometimes it's not. Like how do you make sustainable decisions? So there's a lot of lessons all around on like how do you relate to the system that we built as the shared system that we hold together, and how do we maintain that in a way that suits us all? That's the ask on a technical level, which means people need to think for agenda setting. What are the gaps? They need to think in terms of review terms of how does that all fit together? What are good decisions to make? Do they fit together? Like, all of that. And that goes to also back, by the way, to the Frankenstein question that you asked, right? Because the alignment thing, getting alignment organizational level is a whole other beast.
Yeah, definitely. I can relate to that. Is there any responsibility ingredient into it? So, okay, it's good. I want to mingle with others. I want to organize with others. But at the end, how may I know if I'm doing well? Is there a way for the market to decide if you are, for profit, maybe organization, or maybe in the healthcare space, a patient? Is there a feedback coming from outside, inside, and telling you, okay, you're doing well as an individual, as a circle, as an organization, or not? And my next question connected to it: how are salaries then connected to roles? Is all of this internal? So we decide then there is something out there, but we don't care? Or actually, what is outside is really important, and then how to connect it to salaries and to feedback?
Right, salaries and feedback. Yes. Um, So the assumption is, of course, that I'm kind of making that is good to make explicit is that everybody who is in an organization is in roles that have to do with whatever the organization does. So they will be in contact with the people that are beneficiaries of their work in some shape or form. And that can be so many things, right? There's actually the like in classic sociocracy, there's basically this idea that every circle has clients, and that could be internal or external clients, but it's always a client, basically. That is the word that is being used. Um, so that means in a perfect world, it's basically in like penetrated with the customer needs because you interact with them on a daily basis because you know what they need. And then it would be unwise not to factor in that feedback. That's because it's always unwise to not factor in feedback. That's I guess the general gist of that. Um, let's see, is there more to say on it? I guess that's maybe an abstract way of saying where you're going, and I think it covers like one could spell it out more, but do we have to spell it out more? Because to me, it's just so obvious that if you don't consider market and customer needs, what are you doing?
How far does it go? So is it impacting money or not?
You mean now salaries or
Yeah,
or
yeah, both. So at the end, if you are providing a service to somebody, internal or external, there will be some value exchange, right?
yeah, and that's I mean I'm aware that that is a thing that comes up a lot in the higher model. So I guess from a sociocratic point of view, there is a clear membrane of inside and outside. So that there is the exchange with customers, but they are outside and internally one can set it. I mean, that's more of a like how do you want to do it question. I think one can like, for example, the model of like one circle charging an internal client, like another circle, a peer circle, so to speak, on the inside of the organization for services. You can do that. Like that's compatible with how sociocracy does things. It's not how most do it, I would say, but it is compatible with it. You could do it. Um, let's see, did you have something else? Oh, salaries. Salaries again, that's a similar thing. The answer is from a systematic point of view, there's many ways of doing it. What I find most interesting about that question is what do you align yourself with? Like, do you use the basic principle of money is tied to roles, or do you use the basic principle of money is tied to being a part of the organization? Like some organizations run like an extreme case of every role that you take on comes with a price tag, that's like however many this or that. And some organizations lean heavily on what is almost like a universal basic income on an organizational level. You're part of the organization, now you're paid, now figure out what you want to do. But it's not going to ever be compared of like your roles are not going to be added up into your salary.
But
Um,
it is interesting that you are not mentioning among the options the case in which the salary of the individual, or let's say the value that a circle may share with its members, is connected to customer outcomes.
that's one of the things one could do. That's one of the things one can do. On a that it is interdependent with the other two choices, right? Because if you have like a universal basic income, you might like, for example, what I think Gerard Edinburgh, the person who put together sociocracy, what he would have said, and that's just one option on the table, I think, is what he liked was like a let's call it because it's just easy. I don't think it's the right term, but still like an organizational universal basic income. But then there is a variable that has to do with how successful the organization is. But that's a heavily collectivized version of what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right. And then there could be the other extreme. One could say salaries are tied to roles, are tied to circles that then set it according to whatever successes and performance are. You can dial it as collective as you want or as individualized as you want. All of that is possible as long as people set it up that way.
Um, Ayer has this concept very strongly of an ecosystem. An
Mhm.
ecosystem both in market sense, so outside the firm, but also within the firm. In sociocracy, something we didn't yet touch really upon is there is this double linking. So at the end, the circles are connected. There are rules that are in two different circles that create this flow of information and decision between the upper circle and the, let's say, the circles within it. Is there a way in practice, so not just in the theory, that you have seen for many circles to collaborate. So horizontal ways for circles to come together and to do something that regards all their services.
Mhm. Yeah, typically that would be conceptualized in sociocracy as a helping circle. That would be kind of, that would be on an ad hoc basis. It could also be regularly. You could have, for example, if you wanted to evaluate a certain kind of value chain, you could get all the like representatives of all those people together once a quarter or whatever to see how it all works. You could align that with OKRs that are going across circles. Like there's a lot of things that one can do around that. I think it is underused because it's like an extra thing that one needs to do. So that is certainly a thing. Um, but I think that's more in, well, slightly more in the practice than it is in the model. Though it is maybe, I don't know. That's maybe up for discussion. But it is I think possible, and I think it would be nice to do some more of the combinations of kind of where do we follow basically organism logic, where things are clear subsets, that where they have that natural order like you would have in a human organism, and where you form more of a market logic, where there's more of a many-to-many relationship. And I think a skillful integration or combination of those is what would serve lots of organizations well.
But is it fair to say that, let's say, the basic implicit belief is that the subsets mentality is the one more fitting into the model? So at the end, you decompose something bigger into smaller pieces. This
Yeah.
is dynamic. There are many interpretations, so it's not so, let's say, linear or predetermined. But still, the mindset is decomposing the problem in subsets more
Yeah.
than having a network of things that are linked.
Yes, for sure. As long as, and I think people misunderstand that, so let me put one little, yes, and that is assuming that the entity, like the organizational membrane, is one metabolism.
Yeah.
And that's different, for example, from how, Hayam would see it then. But basically, the assumption is this is one metabolism that needs to hold and steward its common resources together in an interdependent way. So it's heavily kind of focused on that interdependence in that entity. Yes.
And again, coming back to what a company is, let's say this membrane, this boundary, is there a way for the firm to act as an investor on new ideas? So let's say that one of the circles or a new circles wants to create something new. And it wants help from the organization. So how is innovation, investments, how are they managed?
Well, again, it's all things one can build. And I think it's not original, like maybe that was not the original intention. The intent, I think the worldview that is kind of baked into it is more that innovation happens at the edges, like basically the most peripheral circles that are most in contact with the outside world, so to speak, and that innovation happens there, but less that there's spin-offs that go in experiment and that is organizationally supported somehow. One can of course build it. Like you can totally, of course, build some sort of like an internal grant giving thing or something, or like like it doesn't even have to be grant. It could just be investments. Of course, you can do that. Like we do, like we're talking about some of that, for example, for ourselves. But it is basically a level of like something you have to piece together yourself. It doesn't come with a system.
So something that we are coming back to, I think, is that there is a sort of basic mechanisms that are given, that are in the toolbox of sociocracy, and then there are some applications that you have to create yourself using the basic mechanism. So maybe connected to that is there a way to give a feed for a circle to give a feedback to another circle that is providing support services? So let's think I'm a customer facing circle and I get HR support, I get IT support. How to keep that other circle, support circle, honest in terms of value for money or the kind of services it provides? Or maybe can I decide to go outside if I'm not happy with them? So I'm not happy with your HR services. I will go outside and buy same services from an agency. Is this something that you ever seen? Let's talk also about your experience because you see lots of organizations maybe, and you can tell us a bit more about the applications in this case.
Yeah. And by the way, there's a really interesting to this use of our own use of sociocracy, because we basically we ran into this ourselves, that very question, right? And what happens is that we basically, how do I it's describe this? We um we took some of the circles, or what used to be like departments, let's say, more like sub-departments, it doesn't matter, and basically made them their own entity and then rebuilt kind of a connection. So we kind of build a market logic into one branch of the organization itself that then gives exactly that feedback of like, you know what, website circle, this is not working for us. And that is exactly like a live discussion on how do we find in collaboration with those kind of market-facing units or like self-contained units, how do we have exactly that conversation that you're talking about? And how do we decide what is kind of the minimum infrastructure that needs to be built and what could be added for extra services and so on? So we have some of that ourselves actually. Let's see, what was your question? I think it's
If I'm not happy with the website team,
yes.
what can I do? What can I say? How can I balance that?
I think in a purely Socratic system outside of what I just described, how we do it, the only thing you have is feedback. In our system, you have all kinds of other things because basically there's a financial agreement between the like self-contained units. And they could just decide to say, you know what, this is not working for us, drop the website thing out of the package, or we're out of here. You could that. But that is, and that goes back to my thing of like, I think sociocracy is great as the building blocks, and then it's your responsibility to combine them in creative ways. There's not one way to do it. And that's I think something that we also learned in looking at higher model, for example, and going like, oh, we could just kind of make those self-contained and then buy us a bunch of autonomy here.
I could say that sociocracy requires lots of maturity and awareness because it gives powerful tools, but at the end, you still own the responsibility of tweaking that and building on top of that. It's not always easy, to be sincere. It's takes lots of years of experience, of practice, of patience, also for reaching what you expect. Maybe comparing sociocracy to another, I don't know, maybe cousin or brother. I don't know, Alacracy. Alacracy talks a lot about the constitution, so coding, let's say, the policies, the rules into sort of book for everybody to read. What does sociocracy think about the constitution? Is a constitution needed, helpful, not needed?
Well, I guess the textbook answer for this is if we go back to what I talked about earlier of like what's your assumption on how exhaustive your system can be? Holacracy is way more optimistic on that one. That everything like, oh, something needs doing, you need a role for it, kind of an basic like starting point attitude. Same with the Constitution, the assumption that you just make it and then it just runs. Like it's leaning more on that very machinist, however you pronounce that, way of seeing it that assumes more doability around exhaustiveness than I would, for example. On the Constitution part, um, or let me put it this way, I'm comfortable with more fuzziness than holacracy is. But
Is
that
it
makes
you or is it sociocracy?
well, I think, well, sociocracy definitely as well,
Okay.
because it doesn't have the requirements of having things, But again, that's where user error, I thought, or misunderstood different codes come in. And I think one of the things is that holacracy makes it easier because it kind of declares that it is easy, just define it all, and while sociocracy is kind of being a little it's leaving it undefined of which model it is in, and then people project their own stuff on it. That's the conversation I want to have more, because I want people to understand that basic principle of everything is allowed until it's not, where you're not assuming exhaustiveness. People need to understand that, otherwise we're just reproducing the same thing. But okay, back to the Constitution. On the Constitution part, there's one interesting piece for me in sociocracy, which is that the Constitution, like, we recommend making constitutions, like we call them different thing, because call them typically just governance agreement to kind of just, I don't know, just downgrade the grandiosity of it, I think. It's just like, no, this is just another agreement. It's just the agreement where we define how we want to operate, and it is something that can also be changed. It should be placed as a domain. Typically, that would be like a mission circle, board, general circle, wherever you want to have it. You could even have just a sub circle that holds the governance agreement in its domain, and from time to time changes things. It's just another agreement. And to me, by the way, that's super important, because some people, kind of hold purpose and constitution as axiomatic, and I don't see that as wise, because it needs to as well change. You can't, whatever you put, it's like, I imagine it like, it's a river that's flowing. Whenever you think you can put something firm into the river, kind of a stake, and assume that it will stay there, then you don't understand how nature works. It will eventually break. That's just how it will be.
Do you think that the amount of exhaustiveness differs between for-profit and not-for-profit organization, or businesses and other kinds of organizations? So in a sense, the typical commercial organization wants to have more clarity, explicit descriptions of quite everything, while maybe non-commercial organizations may be more comfortable with fuzziness.
That might be how they act right now. I don't think that's how it should be. And I'll tell you why. Because grasping the purpose of we need to make money is much easier to grasp and align around without even too many agreements. While what, for example, mission-driven organizations are doing is they're trying to be financially viable and do something in the world, which now means they have competing purpose. Like, one can, like, I'm simplifying. I think there's longer discussions on all of this, but just for people to grasp, like, kind of where I'm coming from, is you basically have competing targets, and now that creates fuzziness. So basically, what I think is you need to be more clear to even operate, because your basic setup is already fuzzier. Making money is relatively straightforward. Everybody understands that. But doing five different things, that gets harder. So I think, while what you're saying is descriptively true, I don't think it's how it should be.
Thank you. So let's go towards the end of this great conversation, at least for me. And overall question I have is, we are so used to, heroic leadership. This big leader saving the world, telling people what to do, predicting the future, energizing. But in a self-managed, self-organized space with lots of fuzziness, what is their mandate like? Not what they do, but what they should do to nurture the system, to still help the system to grow, to thrive. What is leadership into this kind of environment? And who is leadership for? Is it restricted to one, two people in the organization, or maybe to everybody in it?
Yeah. I mean, of course, it's not just going to be one or two people. I assume no listener was assuming that would be the answer. Um, I need to make a tiny little bit of a detour on that one, because I think I've been thinking about this a fair bit, this whole leadership thing. And when it comes up in trainings, here's how I explain it. Basically, there are different functions for coordination that needs to be held in the organization. There's different strategies of holding it. For example, you can say, we have one person that coordinates, and we just go to that person and say, please tell us how it all fits together. That would be like a hierarchical, that's what people imagine should happen in a hierarchical model, though of course that's heavily tainted with all kinds of other stuff. Now, I think it comes down for me on how you understand what the needs of the organization. So if now you have coordination, the leader finds themselves in a context where a lot is fuzzy, and they need to now somehow, with the others, create a situation where there's forward motion and clarity and agency. Because without a little bit of clarity, you don't have agency. So now there's different approaches to that. Again, you can be super heavily leader driven, or you can create the clarity in a more collective way. And then it's already clear. So in a perfect world, from a Sociocratic point of view, the leader is doing a good job when they're absolutely not needed because they've helped collectively create the clarity so it's already fully clear. We know what our priorities are, we know how things work, we know how it's done. Everything is already clear. And we're so tuned into what we're trying to do. We also don't need anybody who's going to motivate us to do it, Like it's just so evident we just do it. That would be kind of more like a systems view of if the system is conducive to doing the thing already, that means the leader is doing their job. And everybody else is too. Now,
So we could get rid of leaders in this case.
now the second part is, but you need that safety net because it will not be that way. So basically, I see leaders as a safety net of like, if you notice that it's not happening, it's everybody's job to notice, but it is that person's job in particular to notice, oh, wait, maybe it's not clear. Maybe that person is bumbling around because they don't know what they're doing. Maybe there's a blockage here and somehow nobody realizes that it could be something that we should bring up. So it's really, I find it's like walking on a tightrope, and you should always have a safety net. I think you should absolutely have leaders and you should rely on them as little as possible because we don't have, safety nets. We don't get rid of them, but we also don't say, oh, you should fall into your safety net every, like, all the time. Like, no, of course you should not use them, but of course you should have it. And it's the same for me for leaders. And another metaphor that I think clicks with people in understanding how sociocracy holds it is ideally, for example, if like some people say, oh, leaders should be whatever, taking care of the emotional states of their people. And they're like, maybe, or you put that into a role and then the leader doesn't have to do it. But it's in the system, it needs to be held maybe somewhere, either in a distributed way or concentrated on a person. Sure, clustered on the leader, clustered at somebody else, clustered into the process. I don't care where you put it, but it needs to be held somewhere. If not, you'll notice. So the metaphor for that is that sometimes when people go hiking, they have this agreement that you have one person who walks in front, and knows the way, and one person who walks in the back and makes sure that everybody came along. And the leader for me is kind of both. And again, if we all know where we're going, that person doesn't have a lot to do. If we all watch out for each other, that person doesn't have a lot to do. And I think you should still have those as a safety net. It's not that complicated to me, really. It's
It is if
complicated to
you
do, but
if you
it's not so
compare
hard
it
to
to
get.
what everybody else is doing, and I think also what most leaders expect to be doing in
Yeah.
organization. So I can relate to the metaphor, but still I see the distance with the reality at least.
Well, and I think that is because we have such a funny view of power because we think power is something that you can hold. I don't believe that anymore. Power is a relationship. Power is a relationship that is held in a context. So if you think that the world is so easy that you just take power in packages and then you hold it and that person now has power in an absolute way, I just do not believe that in the first place. I think it's such a reductionist worldview coming from modernity again that it just clouds our view. And then the world gets very complicated, of course, because you're using a model that is just wrong and ridiculous from the get-go. You can't build the world out of simple building blocks in this way without the relationality and the context of it. But
This
that's
is
what
not a
modernity did for us.
political conversation, but I think there will be many connections to what is happening in the world in terms of accumulating power and believing that you are entitled to that power forever and without limits.
And maybe that's just, sorry, one comment on that. Maybe that's just people's freak out noticing just the level of uncertainty we're at and then kind of going in the opposite and holding power more tightly.
Yeah.
pulling in a controllability more tightly. Maybe what we're seeing is actually a wave, like in surge in that because of noticing where we really are.
And
Mm.
it's also a testimony of the importance of these conversations. Let
Yeah.
me close with one last question. What I call looking from the future.
Mm.
Everybody is talking about AI. Everybody, I think, every organization is asking itself, okay, what will AI mean for us? Let's come to it from an organizational design perspective. Is AI changing the way organizations should be designed? Is some kind of design more supportive of AI? What is the connection in your mind about that? What is the challenge also?
Yeah, I think I have a little bit of a particular view on it. And I only want to hold on to one particular piece because we've already talked about it and because I care about it. Because I think ultimately I have not the slightest idea there will be so many different influences that it's too big for me to even imagine. But there's one particular piece that worries me, and it's both an opportunity and a worry. And it is that I see quite a few organizations do what I'm also doing, by the way, and that is building like a digital twin of your organization, right? Like I'm feeding all the projects and all of that in and all the roles and so on into AI so that then you have a better way of stewarding everything. Um, what I worry about in that is that it nudges us more into this exhaustive worldview of, oh, everything that has happened, like the organization is everything that's written down. I don't think that's true. I think it basically gives us the superpower to lean even heavier on the strategy of let's write everything down, let's define everything. And that's exactly where I don't want to go. And that's already where the train is going. And now AI gives us an extra tool to do it even harder. I'm like, no, just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it. And that's again where I go to the both and of sure, I do it too, because it's super helpful. And of course, I want all of our written stuff to be in alignment. I want to find the gaps and the inconsistencies, yes. And I think we should not think that that is the organization. And it's so easy to believe that. I worry about that.
So the organization cannot be a piece of software. It
It's
shouldn't
more
be,
complex than that.
let's say, an algorithm or a schematic, let's
Yeah.
say.
Yeah. So we're basically giving people who are hungry for controllability a tool to do it even more. That's just like, yeah, that's gonna be a while. In my mind, what like I don't know. Is there going to be an end to it ever? My guess is there will be a long runway of people just going all out on that strategy, and I don't know what needs to happen until we find out that we've now like that we, with a lot of sophisticated data, still using a reductionist worldview that comes from a place of control and wanting to control all the things.
What would we miss if we go that way?
Well, everything like let's imagine we're joining an organization. And you think you understand the organization because you've played a little bit with a chatbot that tells you how things work. Like, what are you missing? Well, you're missing virtually everything else that has to do with the relationships, with the feeling of what it's like, with all the context that you understand if you've ever talked to a customer, like that, like there's just so much more to understand that can be written down. And that's for me a huge piece of just seeing how big, like how many nuances there are in the world and just as a shortcut, because I know people struggle with that because we've been taught, and I mean, I'm a linguist. I've been taught that everything can be expressed in language. That's literally what I spent 10 years of my life on. And I'm now walking away from that, going like, wait, the relationship to like, let's take my son. You cannot reduce the relationship to my son to not even 5,000 pages of text. You cannot, because it's a completely different species of a thing. Relationality is not, and language, that's just no, you know? And or the feeling like caring that comes from years and years of lived history can't be dumbed down in a piece of text or into strategy paper. And I think we're losing so much because, and that's like this is how my whole wise organizations work. the problem is it's in the in-betweens and then the relationships where meaning is. So sure, you can operation like you can be more effective and efficient, maybe. Effective, take that out. Efficient for sure. Maybe more effective in the short run. But you're losing so much. You're losing all the stuff that's fun and that's interesting and that kind of pulls you in. It's the caring, it's the wanting things to happen. Like it's the whole universe of wanting and feeling and relating that we miss. And to me, that's the good stuff. That's why I'm doing it all. I don't do it so that I have like whatever, like 10% more people buying this thing. I don't care. It's fun. And I feel, it's like it's that experience of feeling competent, of caring about the people. I mean, it's so weird that we've been fed the story that purpose is kind of this faraway thing and that gets me out of bed. It's caring about my colleagues that gets me out of bed. Like to me, this is just such an like we do this abstraction thing again, we're like, oh yeah, purpose, like in 200 years the world will be different. To me, we flatten it so much. And anyway, I is my worry that it will flatten it even more, and eventually we'll have to wake up from that fever dream and realize that's what's more real is actually what's right about around us.
Thank you so much, Ted. I think we are at the closure, but I really want to thank you for bringing this in betweenness, this relational part, this fuzziness into these conversations. In addition to the structure, the clarity, let's say the speed, I think that we really need to care and protect these human traits. Maybe they are not so easy to automate, not easy to scale, but they still have lots of value, and maybe they are what makes us what we are and makes our organization what we want them to bring into the world. So thank you so much for your perspective, your knowledge, and your energy.
Thank you so much, Emanuele.
Thank you, and speak soon.